The night Lincoln dreamed of his death. The night was very still. The rain fell without sound against the windows of the White House. Somewhere, far away, a clock was ticking. It was April of 1865, and the war that had torn America apart was almost over. Yet the man who had led it through those years of fire could not sleep. Abraham Lincoln sat alone in his study. The lamplight trembled over his face, showing lines carved deep by worry and time. He held a pen, though he had long since stopped writing. On the desk beside him lay messages from generals, congratulatory letters, and a small stack of unopened envelopes. He looked at them without seeing. His eyes were turned inward. He had dreamed again. It was always the same dream. The corridors of the White House whirred in. The air was thick with silence. Then came the sound, weeping, faint at first, then rising like the wind through trees. He followed it. Room after room stood empty until he came to the East Room. There, a coffin rested beneath a flag. Guards stood at its corners. A crowd of mourners passed slowly by. He asked one of them who had died. The answer never changed. The president. He had told the dream to Mary and to his old friend Ward Hill Lamont. Lamont had begged him to forget it, but Lincoln only smiled. Dreams do warn us sometimes, he said. And if I am to go, I am ready. The candle trembled as he signed another letter. On the desk lay a small pile of theater tickets for its theater. For the comedy Our American Cousin. Mary had insisted they go. The people needed to see their president alive and well, laughing again after so much death. That morning, the city awoke to celebration. Church bells rang, bands marched through Pennsylvania Avenue, and crowds waved flags from every window. Yet, even amid the jubilation, a strange heaviness lingered in the air. Soldiers drank in the streets. The wounded limped through the crowds. Washington smelled of gunpowder and lilacs. In a boarding house not far from the theater, another man rose with the dawn. His name was John Wilkes Booth, actor, Southerner, conspirator. He was 36 and handsome, with the eyes of a man who believed himself chosen for tragedy. For months he had plotted to kidnap Lincoln and trade him for Confederate prisoners. But the South had fallen, and the dream of the Confederacy lay in ashes. Now his plan had changed. In his diary, Booth wrote that morning, "Our cause is lost, but something must be done." He walked to Ford's Theater to collect his mail, nodding to the stagehands who knew him well. The playbill listed that evening's performance April 14th. The president and Mrs. Lincoln were to attend. By afternoon, Lincoln's mood had lightened. He drove with Mary in an open carriage through the city, the breeze soft and cool. Witnesses later said they seemed happier than anyone had seen them in years. "We must both try to be cheerful," Mary said. Lincoln took her hand. "We have come through the fire," he told her. "It is over at last." As dusk settled, the lamps of Washington began to glow. The White House was alive with music. In the streets, fireworks burst like falling stars. The president dressed in black, his tall frame rising in the mirror, the famous stovepipe hat beside him on the table. Before leaving, he paused at the door and turned to his servant. "Good night, Tom," he said softly. "Goodbye." At Ford's Theater, the crowd was already gathering. The play had begun. Booth entered quietly from the stage door, a small Derringer pistol hidden in his coat, a hunting knife at his belt. He moved with the practiced ease of an actor who knew every hallway, every creaking board. Lincoln arrived late, greeted by applause. The orchestra struck a patriotic air as he unmerry stepped into the presidential box. He smiled and waved, then settled into the chair nearest the audience. Below, laughter rippled through the house as the actors delivered their lines. Booth waited. He knew the play well. He knew the exact line that would draw the biggest laugh when the actor on stage would shout, "You sock du law-guising old man trap." And the audience would roar. That was the moment he chose. He slipped into the corridor, placed a wooden bar across the door behind him, and entered the box. For a second, he watched the back of the president's head, the gray hair touched by the glow of the stage lights. Then he raised the pistol and fired. The sound was small, like the pop of a cork. Mary turned. Lincoln's head fell forward. Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. The audience froze, thinking it part of the play. Then they saw the knife, the blood on his hand. The president slumped motionless above. He ran for the back door, his spur catching in a flag, tearing it as he fell. Outside, his horse waited. In moments, he was gone into the darkness. Inside the theater, pandemonium erupted. Soldiers rushed to the box, doctors pushing through the crowd. They carried Lincoln across the street to a small boarding house, the Peterson House, where they laid him on a narrow bed. His long frame barely fit. The night stretched on, silent except for the ticking of a clock. Cabinet members came and went. Mary wept beside him. At 7:22 in the morning, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. The room was still. Secretary Stanton whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." Outside, the sun rose over a nation reborn and broken. The city woke to disbelief. At first, no one would accept it. Rumors passed from street to street. The president had been hurt, someone said. He would recover, said another. But by dawn, the truth was everywhere. Abraham Lincoln was dead. The flag above the War Department hung half-mast. Black crepe appeared on every door. The nation that had survived war now faced grief it could not name. Crowds gathered outside Ford's Theater. Soldiers stood guard. Inside, the stage still smelled of smoke and dust. Someone had dropped a woman's glove. Blood marked the floor. The chair where Lincoln had sat was carried away, wrapped in a sheet. In the boarding house across the street, the bed was stripped and the pillows removed. People whispered that even the air felt different now. The search began before the morning ended. Orders were shouted, telegrams sent, rewards announced. Cavalry patrols galloped south. The assassin had escaped on horseback. Every bridge, every ferry, every road toward Maryland was sealed. But John Wilkes Booth had planned his flight well. He knew the country roads, the safe houses, the sympathizers still loyal to a dead cause. Booth rode through the night, his injured leg throbbing. He stopped at the home of Drive, Samuel Mudd. The doctor set the bone, gave him a crutch, and perhaps understood more than he admitted. By the time soldiers reached the house, Booth was gone. He wrote in his diary as he hid in the swamps along the Potomac. "I struck for my country," he wrote. This blow was meant to avenge, but already he knew the world would not see him as a patriot. His name had become a curse. Rain fell again. Mud swallowed hoof prints. Soldiers searched barns and creeks. Some fired blindly into the reeds, certain they heard breathing. The country itself seemed to hold its breath. For 12 days Booth ran, limping, half delirious, his clothes torn and wet. He crossed the river by night and found refuge in a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. The cavalry found him there. They surrounded the barn and called for him to surrender. Booth refused. "I prefer to die," he said. They set the barn on fire. Smoke poured out. Flames climbed the rafters. In the orange light he stood, carbine in hand, his face calm. A single shot cracked. It was Sergeant Boston Corbett who fired. Booth fell. They dragged him out onto the grass. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Tell my mother I die for my country." Then he was gone. The man who had played heroes on stage had written his own final act, but no one applauded. In Washington, the mourning deepened. Shops closed. Churches overflowed. Bells tolled without end. People who had never seen the president felt as though they had lost a father. Walt Whitman walked the streets that day and wrote later that a great star had disappeared from the sky. Lincoln's body lay in state beneath the Capitol dome. Thousands came, silent, waiting in line through the night. Some carried flowers, others only bowed. Soldiers stood with heads lowered. The air was heavy with waxen tears. When the train left for Springfield, Illinois, it moved slowly, its wheels grinding over the rails like a heartbeat. The coffin lay in a car draped with black velvet. Along every mile of the journey, people gathered, farmers, widows, freedmen, children standing in silence as the train passed. They said the sound of it stayed with them for years. At every city, the coffin was carried into halls hung with black cloth. In Cleveland, the rain fell on umbrellas like soft applause. In Chicago, choirs sang but their voices broke. When the train reached Springfield, the air was still. The coffin was carried to Oak Ridge Cemetery and placed beside the small grave of his son Willie. The dream had come true exactly as he had seen it. The weeks after the funeral were dry and endless. Washington moved as if underwater. The war had ended, yet the air felt heavier than before. Newspapers printed his last words, his last meetings, his last smile. People searched the small details for meaning, as if they could turn them back into life. Mary Todd Lincoln remained in the White House for a few days, then could bear it no longer. The rooms that had once echoed with laughter now held only the sound of footsteps. Every object seemed haunted: his coat on the chair, the pen he had used, the hat he had left by the door. Servants heard her talking to him, softly as if he were just in the next room. When she finally left, she closed the door behind her without looking back. The city watched her carriage roll away in silence. Outside, the soldiers who had fought in his armies returned home to fields gone to weeds. Freedmen wandered the roads, searching for family. Veterans with empty sleeves sat on porches, remembering his face. His name became a prayer whispered in small towns and quiet kitchens. If only he had lived, they said. In Springfield, visitors came by the thousands. They walked the long road to his tomb, hats in hand. Some touched the stone. Others stood at a distance. Old men who had once cursed him now wept openly. A boy was heard asking his father why everyone was crying. The man answered, "Because we have lost the one who held us together." The country began to build him into something larger than life. Pain demanded meaning. And so, stories multiplied. They said he had dreamed of his death. They said he had spoken to angels. They said he had foreseen everything. Whether true or not, it no longer mattered. The stories gave shape to the loss. They turned grief into faith. Newspapers printed recollections of his dream. Preachers read them from pulpits. Children learned them as if they were scripture. The image of the coffin in the East Room became part of the American imagination. It was not just his death they mourned, but the idea that goodness itself could be struck down. In the years that followed, the war survivors built monuments, wrote memoirs, held parades. But nothing filled the absence. Every 4th of July, speeches spoke his name. Every election, someone invoked his memory. He had become both man and myth, the president who walked between life and legend. Mary never recovered. She moved from place to place, writing letters to spiritualists, seeking messages from beyond. Some mocked her, others pitied her. In her loneliness, she returned again and again to that night, to the dream her husband had told her, to the sound of the shot she could never forget. Meanwhile, in quiet towns, veterans still told stories of him, how he shook their hands, how he spoke their names, how he made them believe the country could survive. They spoke not of his power but of his kindness. Time did what time always does. The sharpness of grief faded, but the emptiness remained. Decades passed. New wars came, new presidents rose and fell. Yet in the White House, the story lingered: the dream, the prophecy, the quiet acceptance of fate. Guards who patrolled at night whispered of footsteps in the upper hallways. Some claimed to see a tall figure in shadow, pausing before the East Room. The scent of tobacco and lamp oil followed. Then nothing. Perhaps imagination, perhaps something more. But the story endured, and so did the dream. Years passed into decades. The century turned, and the war that had once seemed to define everything became memory. But Lincoln did not fade. He remained, not as a shadow, but as a presence. His portrait hung in schoolhouses and courthouses, in libraries and small-town post offices. Children recited his words without knowing the nights of pain behind them. When people spoke of freedom, they spoke his name. When they spoke of forgiveness, they spoke it again. His face, calm and grave, became the mirror of the nation's conscience. Writers searched for the man within the myth. Walt Whitman, who had watched his funeral train pass, wrote that Lincoln was the sweetest, wisest soul of all my days and lands. Historians debated the details, but ordinary people simply remembered how he made them feel that even in ruin, humanity mattered. In times of crisis, his words were read again. In wars that followed, soldiers carried his speeches folded in their pockets. Presidents quoted him in their own hours of trial. He had become a language of courage, not loud, not proud, but patient. Still, the dream lingered. Generations later, people told it as if they had heard it themselves. The long corridors of the White House, the sound of weeping, the flag-draped coffin. The dream had become part of the American soul, repeating itself in every era when the nation faced itself and asked what kind of people it wished to be. In the quiet of the East Room, late at night, guards still whispered of a presence. A tall man walking slowly, his hand resting against the wall, his eyes distant. The air would grow colder, they said, in silence. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps some dreams do not end when the dreamer wakes. History would write him in simple words: born in a cabin, died a martyr. But the truth of him was larger. He was not a saint, not a legend, but something harder to name: a man who carried the sorrow of millions and still believed in mercy. He had lived through division and chose reconciliation. He had known despair and still spoke of hope. He had seen the worst of humanity and refused to hate it. And so the story returned to where it began. The night before the end. The dream. He walks again through the halls of the White House, alone. The sound of weeping fills the air. He follows it, room after room, until he reaches the East Room. There, beneath the flag, the coffin waits. The guards stand still. The candles flicker. He asks the question once more: who is dead in the White House? The answer comes softly like breath: the president. He looks at the coffin, and then at the flag, and perhaps he understands that it was never about him at all. It was about what would survive. About the idea that mercy could outlive violence. About a country still trying to learn how to be whole. The dream fades, but the silence remains. The rain falls outside the window again, just as it did that first night. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticks, and in that sound, faint and steady, the dream continues, a dream of a nation forever waking, forever remembering the night Abraham Lincoln dreamed of his death. He had carried the war within him for long years. Each morning began with telegrams. Each night ended with names. He learned to read loss in the thin lines of code that came from the front. Numbers were not numbers to him. They were towns emptied of sons. They were mothers who would wait at windows and never see a shape return on the road. He did not speak of this often. He showed it in silence. He showed it by standing, hands behind his back, and looking into a distance only he could see. He had not been born for ease. He had come from a cabin, from hard ground, from an axe and a book held in the same hand. The young man who read by firelight became the man who wrote by lamplight. He carried words like tools. He used them to lift what muscle could not. He learned that a nation could be moved by a sentence if the sentence carried truth. By the time he reached the presidency, he was already familiar with the dark. In the first spring of the war, Washington shook at rumors. People spoke of invasion. They spoke of betrayal. He answered with firmness and with patience. He answered with a letter to a mother of 5 dead sons. He answered with orders that hurt him to sign. He answered with the Emancipation Proclamation when the war had to mean more than lines on a map. He did not pretend that freedom came easily. He knew it cost blood. On winter evenings, he walked the wards of the hospitals. He leaned over cots. He listened to broken voices. He held hands that would be cold by morning. He told a joke when a joke would bring a little breath back to a tired chest. He stood in silence when silence was the only respect he could give. The soldiers watched his face. They said he did not look like a king. They said he looked like a man who would not refuse you if you asked him for time. When he wrote the words at Gettysburg, he chose plain speech. The field still smelled of iron. Graves were fresh. He spoke for 2 minutes and sat. The crowd barely understood what had happened to them. Later, the words followed them home and changed with the years. They sounded different as the nation healed. They sounded like a prayer spoken over work, not ceremony. He had meant it that way. He learned to carry both grief and use. He learned that sorrow could not stop motion. He began to believe that mercy was strength. He believed that the victors must not become new tyrants. He believed that the law must walk with kindness or it would be a mask for cruelty. He had little patience for pride. He asked men to do their duty and he asked them to forgive where they could. In the last winter of the war, snow fell over Washington and turned the city quiet. He wrote the words of the second inaugural in a measured hand. He did not promise thunder. He spoke of charity for all. He spoke of binding up wounds. He spoke of doing all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. The crowd listened. Some wept. Some looked away. The war had taught them to distrust promises. But the tone of the words settled in the country like a blanket over a child. He did not think himself great. He thought himself responsible. He had a way of turning praise aside. He said he was a poor hand to boast. He said the work was not his own. He said the work belonged to the people who had borne the battle and to the widows and to the orphans. He placed himself among them rather than above them. The last week of his life did not announce itself as last. It had small duties. It had meetings that felt like every other meeting. He laughed more. The lines on his face softened. Those who knew him said he looked 10 years younger. They said a weight had moved from him and was now a shadow on the floor. He spoke of the future. He spoke of a gentler reconstruction. He spoke of how to treat the South as a sick friend rather than an enemy to crush. He met resistance. He spoke again, softly, and he waited. He knew the country would need time to catch up to mercy. The dream continued to visit. He never chased it away. He let it sit beside him like an old companion. He did not look for omens in every sound. He simply took in the warning and put it where it could not rule him. On the afternoon drive, the city appeared new. The war seemed far. Children waved. Soldiers lifted their caps. He held Mary's hand, and for a few blocks he could believe that the worst was done. He could believe that the country might learn to breathe without pain. He could believe that the loss would not be lost in vain. Then the carriage turned and the day returned to itself. Work waited. Light faded. Evening came on like a soft tide. Across town, Booth rehearsed the role he had written for himself. He tightened and tied the brace that would hold his leg if it failed. He checked the small gun more than once. He said the lines he would shout as he fled. He searched his face in a mirror and saw not a murderer but a man who would be remembered. He did not think beyond that. He did not think of mothers. He did not think of small hands folded over quiet chests. He thought of glory. It made him feel warm. He had maps in his head. He had friends who would not speak his name aloud. He had a route that would carry him over water and through reeds. He tasted the sweetness of escape before he had done the deed. That sweetness was part of the poison. It kept him from doubt. Back at the theater, a carpenter adjusted a hinge. A lamp was trimmed. A dress was sewn. Everyday work went on while history walked toward its point. No one knew the exact minute. No one could have named the sound that would change the air. All they felt was a slight pressure, like weather about to turn. Night fell over the city and laid a thin sheen on every roof. People opened windows to let in spring. Horses snorted in the streets. Newspapers curled on steps. The pattern of life held. Inside the White House, he took up his coat and placed a hand on the back of a chair as if to steady himself against something only he could feel. Then he turned and left for the last time. In the days after, the city felt hollow. The gas lights burned, but the light did not seem to touch the walls. The war was over, and yet something vast and unfinished hung over everyone. They stood in doorways. They walked without destination. They waited for instructions that could not arrive because the only person who would have given them had gone where they could not follow. The train that carried him moved through the heartland like a slow thought. At small stops, farmers lit bonfires and stood with their hats in their hands. Choirs sang in the cold. Black ribbons fluttered from windows. The engine breathed and paused and breathed again. People taught their children to remember the sound. They did not want forgetting to come too easily. In one town, a woman placed a sprig of lilac on the rail. In another, a man who had sworn he would never forgive wept without shame. Along a fence, freedmen knelt on the damp ground and prayed aloud. The train entered night, and the field slid past like pages being turned without noise. The bell marked the miles the way a clock marks years. Nothing hurried, nothing delayed. Springfield received him with stillness. The prairie seemed to bow. The sky was a pale sheet stretched tight. He was carried past people who would speak of that day to grandchildren yet unborn. He was laid beside the child he had lost. The stone that covered them both was simple. People found that right. Greatness did not need grandness. It needed rest. The country moved on because it had to. Government does not stop. Crops do not stop. The hungry do not stop. But something had shifted in the ground under every step. People asked themselves new questions. They weighed their anger. They tried to imagine what forgiveness looked like when handed out at scale. They failed often. They tried again. In that trying, they kept him alive. Booth's death did not end the story. It prevented him from writing his own ending. Others would write it, and they would not be kind. He would be remembered, but only as a name attached to a wound. He had wanted the stage. He got a footnote. In a White House, new footsteps lured at the old halls. Portraits watched in silence. Guards adjusted to a different gait. The East Room returned to receptions. The dream returned to whispers. Now and then, someone working late would pause, listening, sure that a soft tread had passed just beyond the lamp's reach. They told no one or told only one. The story kept itself alive. Years later, when boys became men and men became old, they told the young about the night of the dream. They did not shout. They did not dramatize. They spoke as if placing a small object into careful hands. They wanted the young to feel the weight without fear. They wanted them to know that a nation could be brought back from a cliff by patience and pity, and that even then, cruelty might still find its moment. They wanted the young to understand that the answer was not to harden, but to endure. On long evenings, teachers read his words aloud in one-room schools. The stove cracked. Snow piled against the door. Children repeated phrases until the sound of them settled in their bones. Government of the people. By the people. For the people. The line was not music. It was instruction. It told them what was owed. In small towns, veterans met in halls with plain wooden chairs. They wore old uniforms that no longer fit. They spoke of marches, of rations, of the smell of rain on canvas just before dawn. When they spoke of him, their voices changed. The sharpness fell away. They spoke of his hands, of his listening, of how he made each man feel less alone with his suffering. They called that leadership without ever using the word. The widows who lived for decades after the war kept his memory as if it were a plant that needed watering. They trimmed, dusted, and rearranged a portrait. They taught children to say his name with softness. They corrected anyone who made him into marble. They said he was kind. They said, do not forget that. On courthouse lawns, statues rose. Some were grand, some were modest. Pigeons found them all the same. The stone faces looked into weather and did not change. People argued about what the statues meant. That was part of the point. A nation that argues about meaning is a nation still alive. He entered literature not as a character but as a presence that bent sentences toward plain truth. His name stopped writers from inflating the air. His example checked the ego in the room. He was the reminder that the work matters more than the worker, and that the worker is measured by the tenderness he shows to those who have less. Meanwhile, the dream remained as a quiet pattern under American thought. It appeared in sermons in times of trouble. It appeared in editorials when the nation felt ashamed of itself. It appeared in living rooms when a family turned off the lamp and wondered if the future would be kind. It appeared in the White House when a president walked alone and counted the cost in silence. There were moments when the country forgot him. Prosperity does that. Noise does that. But the forgetting never lasted. Crisis lifted his words back into light. In those moments, he returned as if he had only stepped out to think and had come back with a clear sentence that could be carried like a lantern. He did not belong to one party. He did not belong to one region. He belonged to anyone who chose patience over rage. He belonged to anyone who forgave without pretending that harm had not been done. He belonged to anyone who kept faith with the unknown listener, the future citizen who would judge our choices after we were gone. It became common to say he saved the Union. That was true. But the deeper truth was that he preserved the possibility that the Union might be worth saving. He did not worship power. He treated power as a tool that must be cleaned and returned to the bench at night. He did not call his opponents enemies. He called them misguided friends. He did not confuse victory with virtue. When people visited the White House, they asked to see the East Room. They walked slowly. They spoke in low voices. Some placed a hand on a wall as if the plaster could remember. The guides did not tell the dream. The visitors told it to one another. It was that kind of story, now communal, carried, set down, picked up again. In Springfield, the tomb aged and was repaired. Flowers came in spring. In winter, the wind scraped over stone and made a thin music. A caretaker learned the names of regulars who came to stand and say nothing. He learned to recognize the moment when a person's breathing changed from ordinary to reverent. He stopped sweeping then. He let silence do its work. Scholars continued to argue. They counted letters. They compared drafts. They tracked the arc of policy through battle and back again. Their work mattered. It kept the facts near at hand. It did not explain why ordinary people still felt a tremor when they spoke his name. That required a different language. It required the plain vocabulary of loss and gratitude. He became useful to the better angels that lived at the edges of American life. When hatred rose, his face appeared in pamphlets and posters and in the quiet corners of memory. He made hatred feel small, not by shouting it down but by outlasting it. He made cruelty feel like a phase a nation could grow out of if it chose to act like a grown nation. His death did not make him. His living did. The dream was only a door through which the living had to pass. On the other side, the work continued. People voted. People volunteered. People comforted neighbors. They failed. They tried again. The motion itself honored him. Late-night clerks in government buildings kept coffee warm and read his speeches when the work felt too large. A sentence would place a hand on their shoulders. The pressure would lift. They would turn back to the stack and begin again. This is how a republic endures, not only in grand events, but in the quiet recommitment of tired people at desks. In farmhouses, a copy of his portrait hung beside a calendar and a nail where keys were kept. The paper yellowed. The frame loosened. No one threw it out. Children asked who he was. The answer came with a tone that made them stand a little straighter. Not out of fear. Out of respect for the work he had asked of them, though he had never spoken to them at all. In big cities, his face rode the walls of schools and the sides of libraries like a slow river of patience running through noise. People hurried past and did not look. Then one day, they stopped. Crisis has a way of turning faces into mirrors. They saw themselves as they wished to be seen by those who would come after. They saw steadiness. They saw kindness. They saw resolve without swagger. And then they walked on and tried, if only for an hour, to be that. When presidents stood where he had stood and spoke to a nation that doubted itself, cameras caught the portraits behind them. His was the portrait that steadied the room. It did not lecture. It watched. Watching was enough to quiet some of the fever. Watching was enough to make silence feel like a choice rather than a failure of speech. The dream remained not as fear, but as instruction. It said, remember that power ends. Remember that fame fades. Remember that the only thing that outlasts the office is the way you treated those who could do nothing for you. Remember that a nation can mourn and still move. Remember that humility is not weakness, and that mercy is a form of strength that does not need noise to be believed. So the story traveled. It crossed generations without getting tired. It crossed regions without asking for permission. It crossed the distance between strangers and made them neighbors for the length of a memory. It did what good stories do. It made courage ordinary again. There were other dreams in American history and other nights, but this one stayed because it was simple. A corridor, a room, a coffin, a question, an answer. The simplicity left no room to hide. It brought the listener to a quiet place where truth could be heard without music. The guards who told of footsteps did not ask to be believed. They spoke because saying the words made them stand straighter on their posts. The idea that the past still walked near them made duty feel close to honor. It tied their small watch to a larger watch that had no end. Sometimes visiting dignitaries asked to spend a moment alone in the East Room. They stood and looked at the long stretch of floor in the simple light. They had been saluted all their lives. In that room, they lowered their eyes. Power entered and left softer than it had arrived. That was the room's work now. At night, when the mansion was quiet, a steward might pause by a window and watch the rain blur the lamps on Pennsylvania Avenue. He might think of a man sitting up with a pen in his hand. He might think of letters that had to be written to mothers. He might think of walking home at dawn to a small kitchen and pouring coffee, while the city woke and the nation moved on because it had to. In classrooms, The story was told and retold. Teachers simplified dates, clarified motives, corrected myths, and still something remained that could not be corrected away. Children who had not yet suffered learned to feel for those who had. The story practiced their empathy so that when life required it, the muscle would be ready. In libraries, researchers opened boxes with white gloves and unfolded letters that trembled at the edges. They read words that had been carried in pockets through rain. They counted ink blots. They held fragments of ribbon and locks of hair and pieces of stained cloth, not because relics have power, but because touch is sometimes needed to bridge the distance between the living and the dead. They closed the boxes gently and signed their names with care. In churches, preachers spoke less about the man than about the virtues he had practiced. Patience that does not grow bitter. Courage that does not grow proud. Justice that knows its own limits and kneels before mercy. Congregations nodded. They recognized these as the virtues that hold a neighborhood together when laws lag behind love. In quiet houses, people sat at kitchen tables late and read a page aloud. The reader's voice was flat. The words did not need flourish. They needed honesty. Someone at the table would lift a cup and then set it down without drinking. The silence after the sentence did the rest. When parades rolled on Memorial Day, children waved flags that were too large for their hands. Brass bands played. The old men saluted with fingers that shook. The names on the stones did not change. The living changed. They grew out of their uniforms and into other kinds of service, the ordinary kind that keeps streets swept and libraries open and hospitals clean. The story made that work feel sacred. And when storms came, when hatred spoke loudly, when fear tried to turn neighbor against neighbor, the dream returned as a line in the mind. Who is dead in the White House? The answer reminded them that leaders' patent ideas remain. It reminded them that grief can either sharpen cruelty or deepen tenderness. They asked them which future they wanted to build with their hands tomorrow morning. The funeral train lived on as a slow image under American thought. A line of black cars pulled by a patient engine through fields just beginning to green. Town after town under soft rain. Faces lit by lanterns. The window of the car like a moving mirror where the living saw themselves remembering. The train's pace taught a lesson that speed rarely teaches. It taught the country how to say goodbye together. In Springfield, on certain evenings, the prairie sky turned the color of pewter. A line of geese crossed the horizon. The caretaker locked the gate and stood for a moment with his hand on the iron. He felt no voices. He felt no ghosts. He felt only a quiet correctness, as if the land itself approved of the way the story had been carried. He turned and walked home as the light died and the first house lamps came on along a distant street. Back in Washington, a young staffer worked late. Papers formed small walls on his desk. He was new to the work and afraid of it. He opened a book and found the words that hundreds had found before him. They did not promise ease. They promised meaning. He copied a sentence on a card and kept it by his phone. It steadied his hands in arguments. It slowed his breathing in crises. It helped him treat strangers as citizens and opponents as neighbors he had not yet learned to like. The story did not grant perfect lives. It did not cancel sorrow. It did not cure cruelty. It made these bearable by reminding people that they were not the first to face them and would not be the last. It placed each person inside a long line of those who had tried to do right with limited light. That sense of company was a form of strength. Sometimes, late, a president walked alone and paused outside the East Room. He looked in and saw only floor and air and the reflection of a lamp. He thought of the weight of choice. He thought of the sentence he was about to speak to a nation that might not want to hear it. He thought of the dream and of the question and of the answer that never changed. He spoke softly to no one and to everyone. Then he turned and went to do his work. Thus the dream continued without sound effects, without music, without any help from a stage. It survived because it did not depend on craft. It depended on Ruth carried simply. It depended on a cadence anyone could read. It depended on a courage that looked like gentleness, and on a gentleness that did not surrender to lies. The rain keeps falling. The clock keeps ticking. The corridors remain. The room remains. The flag remains. The work remains. The story goes on because the people go on. And when they falter, the story reminds them how to stand again, and how to stand without stepping on another's throat, and how to step forward without forgetting who fell behind. The night returns. The question returns. The answer returns. The nation wakes again to try again. That is what endurance sounds like when spoken plain. The assassin's trail, when told slowly, reveals an opposite lesson. It shows how a mind can choose a narrow road and call it honor. It shows how praise on a stage can turn into a hunger that devours judgment. Booth believed he was making history. He did not see he was shrinking himself to a single act that would be remembered without respect. His diary reads like a mirror held too close to the face. Every line fogs with breath and never clears. The men who helped him did so for small reasons that felt large in the moment. Anger, pride, loyalty to a banner that would never fly again. They did not imagine the weight of what they were placing on the country. They did not imagine how long shadows can be. They did not imagine the children not yet born would know their names and turn away. The manhunt, told fully, is the story of a nation that refused to let the plot become a legend. Farmers told soldiers what they saw. Ferrymen pointed downriver. The net closed, not by magic, but by cooperation among strangers who shared only a sense that a line had been crossed. This is how democracies defend themselves, not only with armies, but with the daily courage of ordinary eyes and hands. When the barn burned, flame wrote an orange script on cedar beams. Smoke cut the air. The shot that ended it did not make heroes of the living. It made everyone quiet. The body on the grass was not victory. It was evidence. It documented the cost of a single violent idea. The soldiers kept their distance. The dawn came without triumph. The paperwork began. Trials followed. Some were swift. Some were muddled. Mercy and justice argued on paper. The country learned again that punishment cannot restore the dead. It can only mark the living with choices. The trials ended. The arguments did not. Law is a river that does not wish to freeze. Meanwhile, the work of reconstruction rose from meetings and memos and the sound of hammers. Men climbed ladders. Women organized schools. Freedmen formed churches and mutual aid. Towns wrote new charters. The nation did what nations do when they must create a future from ash. They built. They argued. They hired. They failed. They rebuilt. They tried again. They did all of this with his portrait watching from a wall or from the inside of a lapel. In those years, the dream's question took on new meaning. Who is dead in the White House? The answer might have been the man. But the deeper answer was that old habits were dying too, and did not wish to die. Each advance met a hand that pushed back. Each right recognized met a trick dressed as law. The struggle became quiet and administrative. It moved from fields to rooms, from rifles to pens. People learned a new courage, patient, procedural, persistent. There were reversals. There were betrayals. There were nights when it felt as if the war had taught nothing. But the story kept teaching. It taught that despair is a luxury for those not yet tired enough to work. It taught that rage burns up the tools needed for tomorrow. It taught that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing not to be chained to the worst day. Thus the dream stayed useful. It reminded presidents and clerks and voters that the office is alone. It reminded them that the corridors they walk will exist after their footsteps are gone. It asked them to live in such a way that a guard on the late shift would speak of them with respect. The funeral train appears again here because grief must be practiced. A nation that cannot mourn cannot change. The train moves slow enough for people to decide what kind of citizens they would be in the morning. Some failed that decision. Some passed it on to their children like a promise sealed in bread and draped in cloth. Today, when tourists stand in line in Washington and pass from room to room, they carry phones and schedules and a low hum of hurry. In the East Room, their voices thin, screens dim. For a moment, they inhabit the same quiet in which the dream lies. It is not superstition. It is the human mind knowing when to bow. And when the tour ends, and they step back into sunlight, they walk a little slower. They hold the door for a stranger. They speak more gently to a child tugging a sleeve. This is how stories do their work, not only by stirring grand vows, but by adjusting the ordinary hinge of the day by an inch toward mercy. At night, back at home, someone will tell the story to a person who did not make the trip. They will tell it plain. Anan dreamed of a coffin in a room. He died as he dreamed, but the country did not die with him. It learned to carry his work forward in small ways. It learned to honor him not by worship, but by imitation. and the listener will nod. And hours later, lying in bed, they will hear rain and a clock in the hallway in their own house, and they will feel less alone with their century, and they will sleep. So the account returns to the single image that holds everything together. A corridor heavy with quiet, a room lit by plain light, a flag folded into geometry, a question asked without dramatics, answer spoken without flourish. The power of it lies in the absence of decoration. Plain truth does not need gold. He asked the question as if he did not know, but he knew. He asked so that the nation would hear itself answer. The reply was not only about a man. It was about an office and a trust and a kind of hope that cannot be put back into a chest and locked. The answer was a charge left with the living. He had lived in such a way that the answer did not end the story. It started a different one. It placed the weight of the next chapter into the hands of readers not yet born. It said, keep the Union worth saving. It said, bind up wounds. It said, measure power by the restraint it shows. It said, forgive where you can and fight where you must. And know the difference. The rain goes on. The clock goes on. The corridors and the room and the flag go on. The work goes on. Not by miracle. Not by speeches alone. By the ordinary daily choosing of people who decide to be citizens rather than spectators. That is the only proper ending to the story, and it is not an ending. It is an invitation. The night was very still. The rain fell without sound against the windows of the White House. Somewhere, far away, a clock was ticking. The nation hears it still. The dream belongs to the ages now. And so does the answer. And so does the work. And so, if we will have it, do we? There are moments when nations forget their beginnings. Comfort dulls memory. The story of the man who dreamed his own death waits until discomfort returns. Then it rises again. It comes back not to glorify him, but to remind the living what steadiness looks like when the ground moves. After great wars, after depressions, after riots, the story reappears. A radio host tells it during a blackout. A teacher reads it during a storm. A soldier copies a line into a field notebook. The rhythm never changes. Rain, corridor, question, answer. Each generation translates it without needing to change its bones. In the 1930s, when bread lines stretched through cities, his words were printed on posters above soup kitchens. In the 1940s, men carried his speeches in pockets as they crossed oceans. In the 1960s, his portrait looked down from walls where voices demanded that freedom be real, not rhetorical. Every age found in him a permission to continue. Every age borrowed his calm. The 20th century ended, and screens replaced paper, but the story found new shapes. It became audio. It became film. It became a quiet presence in feeds that otherwise shouted. It was quoted by presidents on janitors. It lived because it was short enough to memorize and deep enough to need a lifetime to understand. The dream did not predict only one death. It warned of what happens when mercy sleeps. It warned that victory can rot into vanity, and that power without empathy repeats history in new uniforms. It asked the listener to stay awake. Visitors to his home in Springfield still walk through the small rooms and stop at the desk where he wrote. They see the pen. They see the worn chair. They understand that greatness begins in small endurance. The guide speaks softly. The group stands still. Outside, buses pass and modern time resumes. Inside, the air holds a gravity that feels like truth. In Washington, under lights, schoolchildren stand before his seated figure. They tilt their heads back. They whisper. The size is deliberate. It forces humility. Yet even there, the scale is not what moves people. It is the stillness. The sculptor understood that silence speaks longer than speeches. When night falls over the city, the memorial changes character. Tourists thin. The lights rise from the floor and turn the stone gold. The reflection in the water wavers like breath. A wind moves through the columns. Somewhere in that movement, the story breathes again. A guard might walk the perimeter and glance toward the monument, thinking of the man in the corridor, thinking of the question and the answer, thinking that the country itself is a long experiment in waking from nightmares. He does not know that hundreds of miles away, in a small house, someone is listening to a recording of this story, eyes closed, the voice steady, the sound of rain outside. The listener does not need to see the monument. The listener carries it in the mind. The story has become a kind of national heartbeat. It slows when times are easy. It quickens when the republic shakes. It does not die. It waits for the sound of weeping and begins again. In this, it resembles the man who dreamed it. He never sought immortality. He sought rest for others. The rest never fully came. That is the burden of those who believe deeply in unfinished work. They leave it open so others can add to it. That openness is the reason the dream still fits each century. 160 years have passed. The uniforms are different. The technology is strange. But the question remains the same. Who is dead in the White House? The answer remains the same. The president. The deeper meaning remains the same. That leadership without humility dies. And humility without action is not enough. The nation repeats these lessons until it learns. It is late now. The voice telling the story lowers but does not fade. The sentence is shortened. The light in the room dims. The listener's eyes grow heavy. Yet the words continue in the mind. They move without rhythm, steady as breath. The rain has not stopped. The corridor has not ended. The coffin waits in thought, not in sight. The question is asked again, and the answer is given again. And the dream is passed again to those who will wake in another time and wonder what it asks of them. And so the story ends. We're all enduring stories, and not with closure, but with continuity. A man sleeps. The nation stirs. The rain falls. The clock ticks. The dream goes on.